So this was the cultural milieu in Africa. With the colonial genocide and transportation of captive African people across the Middle Passage in the big ships known as kobena onto the auction block to dance and sing, to get a good price, dressed up and shaved in good clothing, so that they would be bidded for and taken, quote unquote, by a plantation owner and led off in couples, chained things, walking and running and singing like this off to the plantation, miles, hundreds of miles away. So despite all the cruelties of both the colonial and neo-colonial work or activities that have happened in Africa and the doubly colonial activities that happened from settler colonists in the Americas, North Central and South Caribbean, despite that, African people have retained their culture. They have never lost their culture. All these attempts failed. They were able to achieve independence in Ghana by 1957. Kwame Nkrumah, the visionary, who became its first president in 1960, led the country in its first yearnings for independence, similar to the way that here in the Philippines in 1946, the heroes among the independence movements, dating back from the 1890s, in the achievement of independence following World War II in the Philippines, a very similar parallel path, the yearning for self-determination and independence. Despite all these difficulties in plantation life, which is not our topic to go through today because that would take another entire long time, we'll talk just to understand that there were incredible cruelties. Despite all that, the people survived, their culture survived. And instead of having anger and hatred, which is naturally you find in some people, there's an open door to the heart. There's a love that's expressed in this music. Every time I go to Ghana and every time I work with African American culture and musicians in my hometown in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, I play in a gospel choir in an AME Zion African American church. And I'm accepted with love and openness. And that's one of the hallmarks of this culture that I, as an outsider, am very affected by. That even though I am not of the culture, when I'm in the culture, I'm accepted by the people and the practitioners of the art form, whether it be ring shouts or jazz or African drumming, with an open heart and arms. So let's now, in our very short time, look at a few of the ways in which African people and what became African American people survived and thrived and transcended their cultural, political, and socioeconomic environment. One of the things were sorrow songs. They were called sorrow songs because they often had to do with sadness, and they were in 3 lines. And in that sense, they predate and are precursors for the style that probably everybody's heard of and is the theme for this festival tomorrow, blues. 3-line poetic form. Statement of the situation, mostly sad or bad, but sometimes, occasionally not. A restatement with emphasis and then a resolution to give a psychological release. Very ingenious, might I say. It later became adopted to a 12-bar format around the tonic, subdominant, and dominant chords. Again, we don't have the time to go into it today, and I believe tomorrow there'll be workshops and concerts on the blues. But let's all try a sorrow song together. 3 lines. I'm going to say the first part, again, call and response, intense interaction. Your answer in each case will be lay this body down. Instead of this, the vernacular African American language, lay this body down. Let's all say, lay this body down. Can you all sing that with me? Here we go. And lay this body down. So it's a way really of saying, this is too much. I've got to just get away or escape or lay down. My body can't take this. We can't take this anymore. So, lay this body down. Oh, oh graveyard, I'm walking to the graveyard of life. Lay this body down. Oh moonlight, oh starlight, I'm walking through the moonlight as I follow the stars on the Underground Railroad to Harriet Tubman north to freedom and away from the plantation slavery. I'm walking through the moonlight. Lay this body down. Try one more time, sounds good. Oh graveyard, I'm walking through the graveyard. Lay this body down. Oh moonlight, oh starlight, I'm walking through the moonlight. Lay this body down. I'd like to ask David to read to us a section from Imam Baraka, who at the time in 1963 when he wrote Blues People, wrote a seminal book on the history of jazz in America, but he called this book Blues People, because in jazz there's 4 or 5, there's many characteristics, but some of them are rhythmic complexity, harmonic complexity, melodic embellishment and variation, transcendence, a rhythmic drive that you can call swing, but can be manifested in many forms other than the common ride cymbal pattern that we know. But just as, if not more important, an expression of culture and life, and that through a feeling known as the blues. From the sorrow songs, from African songs, now transplanted into actually blues, which will be your topic tomorrow, but a great quote from Leroy Jones about African people and the blues. David, go right ahead. Do you want to make?
No, I'm okay. Good afternoon. The title of the book is called Blues People by Leroy Jones, written in, I believe, 1963. And the title refers to his tracing of African American people through their music. And so it's a very significant title, Blues People. It's giving that name to a whole people who were the people who gave us its music, gave the world its music. So the passage has to do with the transition of Africans, people who were African, to America, to Americans. When they came over on slave ships, they were Africans. And eventually they became African Americans. And he says that the history of this music of these people can be traced through the music. But when did they become American? So here's what he wrote. And the point I want to make most evident here is that I cite the beginning of blues as one beginning of American Negroes. Or let me say the reaction and subsequent relation of the Negro's experience in this country in his English is one beginning of the Negro's conscious appearance on the American scene. If you are taken to Mongolia as a slave and work there 75 years and learn 20 words of Mongolian, and live in a small house from which you leave only to work, I don't think we can call you a Mongolian. It is only when you begin to accept the idea that you are part of that country that you can be said to be a permanent resident. I mean that until the time when you have sufficient ideas about this new country to begin making some lasting moral generalizations about it, relating your experience in some lasting form in the language of that country, with whatever subtleties and obliqueness you bring to it, you are merely a transient. There were no formal stories about the Negro's existence in America passed down in any pure African tongue. The stories, myths, moral examples, etc., given in African were about Africa. When America became important enough to the African to be passed on in those formal renditions to the young, those renditions were in some kind of Afro-American language. And finally, when a man looked up in some anonymous field and shouted, "Oh, I'm tired of this mess. Oh yes, I'm so tired of this mess," you can be sure he was American.
Thanks, David. I'd like to now ask our contrabassist and flutist, drummer, dancer, so many things, Wes Brown, to lead us in a spiritual. And spiritual, again, call and response. So we're going to ask you to help us. And Wes, we're going to do a spiritual in a minute. Let's do a ring shout. And Wes is going. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Ring shout was a device that the African captives used to circumvent the strict, rigid, Puritan ethic of dancing and drumming and instrumental music is evil. So in North America, more than in Central America and South America, which were largely Spanish, French, non-Nordic peoples, unlike those areas where people did keep their drums more often, in North America it was more Nordic and English, which were more puritanical, and therefore an aesthetic that was much different than they could find in the Caribbean, South America, and the southern part of the United States. So African people needed to dance. The only way they could worship God, the only way they could connect with others, was through drumming and dancing and intensification as a transcendence, as we talked about, you just witnessed. So to take this away was to just destroy their spirit. So when the Puritans said you cannot dance, and they defined dance as crossing your legs, okay? Well, the African captives said, all right, well, we won't cross our legs. So they brought their right foot and their left foot up even, but didn't cross. They did it again. And they did it again. And they did it again in the counterclockwise circles, just like you saw with the gahu music.